Okay, let's do it. So hi everyone, thanks for coming. We're excited to have today Roma, which is a PhD student at Brown University, advised by Ellie Public, and she will talk about teaching a language model to be grounded, first steps, and discoveries. We're relatively a small group, so if you have any question during the talk, please raise your hand and I'll direct you to Roma. Let's start.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Roma and everything that I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with my advisor Ellie Pavlik at Brown. So today we're going to be talking about language models and grounding, which are two things that have gotten quite a lot of attention in the last few months. And before we jump into the motivation, let's discuss what each of these words mean. So language models, as we all know, have gotten, again, a lot of attention in the last few years because we've actually seen that the bigger language models that people are training can actually do things and solve NLP tasks that people have been trying to solve for many years far better than they could before. So the two main classes of language models in some sense are generative language models. So for example, of the GPT-X nature that are trained with this sort of self-attention mechanism to generate text left to right. And these are particularly good for things like summarization or generating answers. And they've also been shown to do this kind of few shot training with a small number of prompts to be able to generalize well. The second class of language models are discriminative language models. So these are the BERT-style language models that again have a roughly similar language modeling objective, which is predict the next word. However, they're trained with a masked language modeling objective, which is slightly different from the left to right generation that gives you this kind of language generation ability. For this talk, we focus on generative language models, so of the GPT-X nature, and I'll discuss a little bit why these models are better for the kinds of tasks that we're interested in. And as we've seen, the performance on NLP tasks with these models is just significantly better than most previous models and methods. So for example, on the left, we can see that they can generate very fluent and very coherent text in a way that most models couldn't do before, because again, the task of generating even a simple natural language sentence in a way that is fluent and human-like is actually quite a difficult task. And then on the right, even standard NLP tasks like natural language entailment or sentiment analysis or grammatical corrections can again be done exceedingly well by these models, where we've seen lots of instances of previous smaller models failing on such tasks. When people actually want to understand what these models are doing and probe the representations of these models, they actually find that the models do actually seem to be doing this kind of reasoning that's very intuitive to humans. So for example, on the left, there's a paper that shows that when we test the models for relations in some kind of taxonomy, for example, WordNet, the models can actually, with a very high accuracy, reconstruct the entire taxonomy, which means they do actually know things about relations between words and the meaning and the structural distance between words in some kind of space that they're learning. And then similarly, on the right, if we actually probe the representations to see how they're reasoning about part of speech tags or dependency passes when they're doing well on tasks, we actually find that there is some evidence that models do seem to be doing things correctly, which is quite exciting overall. However, there's been a lot of work that also says that these models have this fundamental lacking, which is by definition, they're not grounded. So there's this paper that says that they argue that the language modeling task, because it's only ever trained on words, which is the form of words, cannot actually know the meaning of the words in the word. So for example, if you take a language model that's seen lots of instances of words like blue and green and red and yellow, and you take it in the word and ask it to differentiate two things from one another, a language model can't actually know what the word blue means or what the word green means if it's only ever seen these contextual occurrences of these words in text without actually realizing what the word means in the world. And then similarly, even if they can reconstruct these taxonomies and they know the relations between words like north and south and east and northeast, this doesn't actually mean anything if they're not grounding it or learning the grounded meaning. So what we want to investigate a little bit in this work is how we can take this, how we can take these language models that do seem to know the sort of relational meaning and the structure between words that occur in text and take it to try to allow them to learn the grounded meaning of concepts. So here's a thought experiment that nicely lays out our motivation for this work. So consider a scenario where you're lost in a forest. You, as a human, know what the words north and south and east and west mean, and you know the relation between these words. So for example, if I were to give you north, you now know with that grounding of the word north in the world that you're in, you know how to orient yourself because you know the relation between the words that exist in the same conceptual category of the word north. So similarly, what we want to try doing is, given that language models do know the relation between words to some extent, what we want to see is if we can ground one word, for example, north, and show a language model what it means to be the word north in the word. Does that mean it can also learn to use the structure between words to ground similar related words within that same conceptual category? For example, words like east or south or northeast. And then to generalize this beyond just spatial directions, within several conceptual categories that we can teach language models with text inputs, if we show them how to ground some concepts within these categories, can they use the structure between all related concepts to extrapolate these meaning to the rest of the concepts that were never taught to them, but that they have seen in their training data at some point during their training? So let's look at some of the grounded concept categories that we're going to consider. The first one, like we saw before, are spatial terms. So for example, words like north and south and east and west that are related to each other, or words like left and right or up and down. If we can show language models some instances of these, and we know that these concepts are all related to each other, can we test if models generalize to the remaining words? Secondly, we also look at colors for example, in a 3D RGB space. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by generalization here?
Yeah, so I'll explain this a little more in the experimental setup, but crucially what we're trying to do is, so we have a bunch of generalization categories that we're very broadly interested in, which is, for example, few-shot generalization or zero-shot generalization. And I'll explain this in detail. I have a slide that covers this. But in the few-shot case, what we're interested in is if we show models examples of what it means to be left or right, can it then learn these concepts in new worlds? For example, a new, array that has positions on the left versus right. Can models do this? And then in the zero-shot setting, which is far more interesting, what we want to see is if we only ever teach the model one concept or some concepts, for example, just left, can it then use that and learn what it means to be right, given that it knew the word form relation between the words left and right? And I'll explain this in a lot of detail with examples of the different generalization cases in like a few minutes. And we also focus on colors. So for example, if we try to show a model what it means to be red in the world, and also what it means to be blue by giving it the RGB code of such colors in the world, can it then extrapolate to other related colors, for example, light blue or dark blue or pink and yellow? And I'll explain in more detail how we set this up. So let's also look at what models we're going to consider for these grounded concepts, and specifically what models can actually adapt quickly to new samples, which is grounded concepts in this case, while preserving pre-trained information. And we consider 6 different types of generative language models. We start with 4 GPT-2 models of sizes 124 million parameters to 1.5 billion parameters, a TNLG model that contains 17 billion parameters, and then a GPT-3 model that contains 175 billion parameters. All these language models, crucially, they've all been trained in pretty much the same way, which is to generate words sequentially from left to right. They differ in that they have different types of training data of roughly the same amount, except some of them have been cleaned more or passed in different ways and given as inputs to the model. And the main limiting factor is that the models have like fundamentally very different sizes, which allows us to evaluate how well the number of parameters that a model has might allow it to generalize in these grounded settings. These models are particularly useful in the few-shot prompting setting, which we've seen in several works. So what people have seen is that handcrafted prompts given to generative language models for this sort of few-shot tuning actually perform just as well as fine-tuning on a very large corpus or training the model from scratch on a large corpus. So for example, in figure 1, if you say translate French to English for a translation task, and you give a model 10 samples of such sentences, that seems to be enough for a model to get fairly good performance on a task of translation. And similarly, if you look at figures 2 and 3 that refer to math problems and SAT analogy questions, just a few samples of examples of these pretty hard questions of reasoning about math problems or SAT analogies seem to be enough for these large language models to do quite well on such tasks. There are like some caveats about the prompts and the way that you give it to the model. So for example, you could have said question and answer, or Q&A and word and description, and just other variants of different prefixes for the prompts that you give into your big language model. But crucially, what people mostly do is fix some sort of prefix for the question and the answer, give about 10 samples of each, and then finally end with the colon with the prefix for the answer, at which point you allow the language model to generate some number of tokens and evaluate how well it actually answered the question. There's been work that looks at how many prompts are needed and whether or not the variation within the prompts significantly matters much. We use insights from all of these works to try to get the prompt style that we want, and we average over those in our results, and I'll explain that in more detail. So here are some example prompts for example, for the RGB code. So if we want to teach a model what it means to be a color in the world, for example, in RGB space, where blue would be 0, 0, 255, and red would be 255, 0, 0, all of these grounded concepts share this kind of space, share this distance relation in RGB space. And what we want to do is see if we can give models some number of samples of colors and test if it can generalize to remaining colors, given that it might know things about the relations between colors from the text pre-training that it has. For example, that orange is kind of similar to red and yellow, and see if it can ground this in the space that we're trying to teach it in the world. There are different types of prompts that we could give to the model. For example, we could say answer or color name or the color name. What we do to fix what we do in our results is find the prompt style that works best on a held out set, and then use that same prompt style for all of the models that we evaluate. Now for the spatial directions, this is how we try to teach models what grounded concepts are. We use arrays of sizes ranging from 3 rows to 8 rows, and similarly for the columns. And what we do is we fill the arrays with zeros and 1, 1, where the position of the 1 reflects the concept that we're trying to teach the model. So for example, in the top left array, the 1 is at the rightmost position, and in the second one, the 1 is somewhere to the right, and those concepts are right. Whereas in the third one, the 1 is somewhere to the left, so that concept is the left concept that we're trying to teach the model. In the next set of experiments, we can also do this with things like up and down or top and bottom to try to teach the model what it means to be these concepts. And then finally, what we want to do is test models in a completely new world, which is a different array size that it never saw before, to see if it can generalize to what it means to be up or what it means to be down or left and right for lots of different test samples that we want to test. So a crucial point before we jump into the experimental setup and results is we want to ensure that models aren't memorizing grounded concepts, and I'll explain what this means. If you look up the Wikipedia pages of something like matrix mathematics, you might see examples of arrays like this that have words such as lower or left or upper or right associated with these matrices or arrays. And these are all things that language models might have trained on many times in their training data, given that they've been trained on most of the text on the web. Similarly, if you look up the Wikipedia page of web colors or RGB colors, you'll see entire tables like this that have hex codes and RGB codes with associated color names right next to these. What we want to do is test if models are actually grounding things that we're teaching them in worlds, instead of just maybe memorizing things that they've seen in the training data because they might have seen that RGB code with that color. And that's not something that we're super interested in for this specific generalization test. To try to get away from this, what we do is use the concept of isomorphism and rotated worlds. So this paper at the bottom tried to evaluate language models in lots of different synthetic ways. And what they've said is that we can say that systems are capable of understanding if their representations are actually isomorphic to the underlying meaning in lots of different worlds. So for example, if we have a different grounding function where maybe in a new world, left actually meant right, or north, south, and east and west were rotated in some way that still preserves the directional relation, if we teach models this new grounding in a new world, can they still do this equally well, given that this still preserves the relation between words that they had learned during pre-training? So just to illustrate this further, if you look at the world on the left, where the topmost point is the color dark blue and the bottommost point is the color dark red, if we rotate this world around an axis by 90 degrees, what we can see is that what used to be dark blue, which is the RGB code that used to be dark blue, when it's rotated by 90 degrees, is now a completely new RGB code, and dark red is now a completely new RGB code as well. Crucially, as you can see, the distances and the relative relations in this space between the two colors remains the same. And as we can see, this is preserved for all of the rotations that we do. So what we do is for every world, we rotate it 3 times by 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and 270 degrees. And as we can see, this preserves how the colors are related to each other, except now the words that are associated with this new with every new world is different from the original, which means we can actually test whether or not they're just memorizing some RGB code with some color. Similarly, we do this for the spatial orientations where we rotate by 90, 180, and 270 degrees. And in all of our results, we average over the rotations as well as the original world to try to compare them. So let's discuss our expectation for this setting of isomorphism and rotated worlds. If you consider your original world and then your worlds that were rotated by maybe 90 or 270 degrees in a way that preserves the relation between worlds, and then you consider a completely randomly scrambled world where if you consider the same points in space, but now a completely random name, for example, dark red and dark blue might be right next to each other, which doesn't preserve the relation between the two colors that was in the original world. What we would hope is that if models know the relation between words and are using this to ground things in the world, if they can learn a grounding in the original world, they should be able to learn a grounding in any of the new worlds, given that what we're teaching them is how to ground a certain number of concepts, and we know that the relation between the other concepts remains the same. However, a grounding that doesn't preserve this, which is the random scramble, doesn't actually have the same generalization pattern, and the results should be random or inconsistent, and models should not be able to correctly assign color names or spatial names to any of the concepts that we're teaching them. So with that, let's jump into the experimental setup and how we prompt models and evaluate things. So these are some of the questions that we're interested in evaluating. The first one is kind of a sanity check, which is few-shot generalization. And here what we want to see is, can models even learn grounded concepts when it's taught to them during few-shot training? So as we saw before, if we give them an array with a 1 on the rightmost side and a 1 on the leftmost side, and we give them maybe 20 samples of such arrays, can they even learn this in completely new arrays and worlds that they've never seen before? Secondly, what we want to look at is zero-shot generalization, which is far more interesting because it ties to the structure between words and how they might use it to generalize. And here what we want to see is, if we only ever teach a model some number of concepts, for example, if we only teach it left, can it now know what right is during test time? Where in the few-shot prompts, we never told it what it means to be left in the world, what it means to be right in the world, but it has seen the words left and right both during pre-training and should know something about the relation between words. What we also want to look at is compositional generalization, where if you think about the fact that a lot of color terms have modifiers to the colors that are things like light or dark or pastel or baby pink and things like that, if we teach models some examples of compositions of these concepts, can they then generalize to new compositions and learn things about the modifiers? And we finally also do this kind of error analysis that looks at what models are actually learning about grounding and how far in the world are there predicted groundings from the true grounding to give us some insight into what they're actually doing. For all of these, we do this for the true world, average over some number of rotated worlds, and then we compare to a random world to try to ensure that models aren't actually just memorizing things and whether or not they're learning groundings. So the metric
yes. In the zero-shot generalization, how can you check the isomorphism evaluation if basically you cannot teach it the new concepts?
So in the zero shot setting, so I guess what we do is, so if you consider the space of colors, if let's say we take like the first rotated world over here, and then we rotate the world 3 times by different amounts. In each of these, what we would do is, for the first rotated world, we would give it 10 samples of 10 colors in the world, and then test it, or maybe 20 or 30 samples, and then test it on the remaining colors. Then for this, we would do the same thing. So basically, we would want to see the accuracy in each world, and then measure the relative change in accuracies, and hope that it's much lower in the random world, and see if it's consistent in the rotated worlds. So we'd basically evaluate each world separately.
But it kind of assumes that the model already has some knowledge about the other colors, which may not be true, but it still may be grounded in some way, right? Like there are 2 concepts here that may be intertwined, which is, one is like the actual knowledge about different concepts. So in this case, colors.
Yeah.
And the second is the actual like grounding, that you know, like what is the position of each color.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess what we assume is that, as we've seen before, models by definition are probably not grounded, given that they've only ever trained on text, and they might have seen some examples of RGB codes during training. But there's no evidence to say that currently language models trained on text know how things exist in the world and what the space between colors are. So what we're trying to do is, in the few shot training, maybe show it 10 examples of what it means to be grounded, and see if we can use that, which is the grounded samples, plus the relation between words that it already knew and had representations for, to learn how those words might ground in the world. Does that answer your question?
So not exactly. So like in this, I'm more asking the zero shot setup where you, like maybe you do, but like it's not clear if the model already knows about the other colors that you're testing on.
So our hope is that the model knows things about the colors in terms of how the word forms relate to each other. So maybe it had learned that orange is somewhere in between red and yellow from the text-only training. And then what we want to see is, if we ground it in any different word, if we ground it to what orange and yellow mean, can it learn red? Given that it knew the text relations between the words, and it now knows the groundings of 2 words, can it then generalize to the rest of the words by using the text structural knowledge?
Right, so that's clear, but I think that maybe what is missing is the test that the model already knows what red means in that world.
Yeah, that would be useful to evaluate. Yeah, so I guess we just that's a good point. I guess we assume that the models don't know what it is at this point, but it would be good to that would be like a pretty easy setup also, which is just evaluate on everything without fine-tuning it, and see what it knows about the groundings, and then use that as another metric alongside. Yeah, that would be helpful. We do also, like when we were thinking about this, we did like this kind of an analysis to see how, like what in the data might have taught it things about grounding in the first place if you take like a completely unfine-tuned model. So we just prompted all the models with just RGB codes or names of colors to see what they generate. And over there, if you try to like evaluate accuracy, which is just take the first word from the language model and see if it's the correct color, that was a pretty low accuracy. Overall, even though they might have seen RGB codes in association with colors, they don't get like a very good performance if you just try to give it to them without few shot fine tuning.
Yeah, but this is also really related to like the actual prompt and like how like, and to the training data it has seen like, yeah, like I think it's pretty hard to assess how models know this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth doing just like the first check of what they know in any new word that is rotated, our expectation would be, given that this is a completely rotated world, for example, the 90-degree color world is not the original color world, which means the RGB codes should be different and the models shouldn't know anything to begin with. It would still be good to check that. But yeah. Okay, so I think this is where I was. So the metrics we use to evaluate models are top one accuracy. So it's worth noting, given that these are generative language models, that when we prompt the model, as we see in some of the previous example of prompts, which is when we end with a colon, the model has the freedom to generate as many number of tokens as it wants. What we do to evaluate models is look at the first token that it generates, which is far stricter than maybe looking at the whole sentence that it generates to see if it contains the correct word. But we just look at the first token to see whether or not it was the correct answer, which is the top one accuracy. We then also look at the full probability distribution that the model gives you. For example, the first most probable word or the second or the third most probable word to see what words exist in the top three predictions of the model. And that's the top three accuracy, which is if the correct answer existed in any of the top three, we give the model a perfect accuracy. And then later we also look at Euclidean distance in the world, which is if the model predicts something like red instead of dark red, or predicts wine instead of dark red, how close was the predicted answer of the model from the true grounding in the world. So let's look at some of these metrics. And again, we look at this in the true world, and then the rotated worlds and the random worlds. So the first one, which is few-shot generalization, this, for example, is a snippet of an example prompt that we would give to the model. So the language model, it sees some number of arrays, and in the few-shot setting, we show it all the concepts. For example, we show it what it means to be right, and we show it what it means to be left. And then we just want to test if it can even learn these. So for example, in this new array, can it learn that this was right, given that it saw different arrays that had a 1 at the right? And does it know what left is? And we do this over roughly 300 samples to assess what the model's accuracy is. And like I said, the model might generate up to 100 tokens, but we just evaluate the first word. So in the first task, which is when we give models both left and right, what we see is that the top three accuracy for the smaller models is actually just significantly low overall. They barely get a 20% accuracy, but the GPT-3 model does far better than any of the others by at least a margin of 20%, and it gets a 76% accuracy. And it's worth noting that the red bar, which is the random rotations, the accuracy in a random rotated world, is far lower than the blue and the yellow bars, where the blue is averaged over 3 rotations, for example, 90 to 270 degrees, and the true world is the original world. However, when we look at the top one accuracy, we see that the model predictions, the accuracies are far lower. However, the GPT-3 model is still slightly higher than some of the others. And we look over some example generations of the models later, because those are quite fun to look at.
How do you interpret the different performances on the random rotation between the models? I'd kind of expect it would be the same.
So I guess, so I have like one slide on this that looks at like the differences in model predictions. What we actually see is that some of the models, which is the smaller models, are actually really bad at the few-shot fine-tuning at all. So given that they can predict any word out of the 10,000 words in their vocabulary, some of the words they predict are often just very random words. So they can be like the or full stops and things like that. However, the larger models, and especially the GPT-3 model, they always predict related words, which is words within that conceptual category. What that means is that these lower performances are probably explained by the models not even predicting things in the related category, whereas these models might actually just, if they're picking things that were mostly related, there's a far greater chance that they might hit the correct answer at some point, whereas these ones tend to predict more random words. So we kind of just see like a difference in the ability of the models to be able to be fine-tuned in this few-shot way, which explains a lot of the differences in performance.
And did you consider only looking at words that are related to what you're looking? So like considering that the subs or like the subwords that are relevant and like choosing the top 1 or 3 from them?
Yeah, we were gonna do that, but that seems like this is like the strictest form of evaluation that we could do, which is let the model generate anything that it could from its full vocabulary and see if it's correct. That would be super interesting to do, and that's something that we're gonna consider looking at, because it would be nice to see in some kind of setting, some kind of restricted setting where we maybe control the words that it can generate from, what that looks like. There were like other suggestions, other things that we might do, which is maybe look at relative positions of words. So for example, over here, if we're teaching the model left and right, and if the correct answer was left, maybe what we're interested in is in the full probability distribution, was left ever above right? And if it was, then that's a good sign that it maybe knows left. And those are all things that we're probably going to do. I think this one makes sense because it's the most strictest form of evaluating that you could have, which is just let the model generate anything and see what the first word is, and then the top 3 words that it could have generated. But yeah, that's a really good suggestion.
The problem, the potential problem that may arise from that is that it generates other words or sentences or whatever that, because of the way that language models are trained, they're not trained on your task, they're trained in general on predicting words. So whatever words or sentences they predict may still be okay and natural, kind of natural, even if it doesn't match your task.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's definitely something we'll look into. And we have I'll go over some examples of the different things that models predict, which gives us some insights into where they fail and where they differ from each other. But yeah.
Cool.
And then similarly, if we look at trying to teach models up and down, we see, again, with the top 3 accuracy, the GPT-3 model actually gets close to 80%, a 78% accuracy. The top 1 accuracy is far lower. And we also see that the smaller models just don't do really well at this kind of few-shot fine-tuning at all, quite consistently. The second thing, which is more interesting, is zero-shot generalization, which is here, if we teach a model some grounded concepts, for example, don't ever show it what it means to be right, but show it what it means to be left. Can models do this? So for example, as we see on the left here, we give models arrays that contain only positions of ones that were on the left side. And then finally, at test time, as you see in the bottommost array, the 1 is now on the right side. And what we want is for the model, what we want to see is if the model has truly grounded what it meant to be left, and now it can know what it means to be right. It's worth noting that this is actually a really hard task because, as we've seen with lots of just fine-tuning of models or training on models, if you only ever have one label class that you give to the model, there's really no reason for the model to predict anything apart from that label class. The thing about few-shot fine-tuning is that given that you're only giving the model some number of samples, it doesn't completely fit to that task, but it does tend to use things from pre-training and has more variance in the things that it says, which is why this seems like a good setup for this kind of zero-shot generalization. But it's still a pretty hard task, given that we never show the model what it means to be right. So over here, if we look at when we teach the model only left, if we try to test it on right, these are what the results look like. So it's a lot lower than what we saw before. That was roughly at 80%. So even the top 3 accuracy over here is about a 65%, which means the model does actually learn what it means to be right 65% of the time. The top 1 accuracy is far lower. And then if we do the reverse, which is only teach it right, and then look at left, these are what the results look like. When we look at the color setting, so over here, in a similar way, given a word that an RGB world that we have, if we teach the model maybe some number of samples of colors in that world and then test it on the remaining colors, for example, this RGB code over here, and we want the model to generate a name, we actually see quite a promising increase in performance of the GPT-3 model over the others, where the model, even in the top 1 accuracy, still gets about a 41% accuracy in predicting colors, which is actually quite a hard task, as we'll go over in some examples later. And we also see that the random worlds actually make it harder for the models to learn how to generalize, which does seem to hint to the fact that they might actually be learning some sort of information about the relation between concepts in that grounded world. What we also want to see is compositional generalization. So if we teach a model compositional concepts, for example, if you think about color modifiers like pastel, where we teach a model what it means to be orange, and then pastel orange, and then pink and pastel pink. And then if we have maybe a set of other colors that were held out, for example, we never showed it blue or pastel blue, can it learn to ground these, given that it's seen some number of modifiers and compositions of those before? Over here, what we do is, for the first set, we look at each modifier. So it's worth noting that we have maybe about 20 different types of modifiers. So you can have things like light or dark or pastel, or you can say baby pink or electric blue. And there are about 20 such modifiers that you could give to colors. When we train a model on each type of modifier, which is just show it pastels, it actually gets a very good accuracy. So the GPT-3 model gets this is close to a 90% accuracy on learning how to ground just that one modifier that we show it. However, when we pool together all of the modifiers, which is put pastels and lights and darks in the same few shot prompt and then test it on the remaining ones, it's a lot harder for the models to do this sort of compositional reasoning when you pool together all of the modifiers. But when we give it each modifier at one time, the GPT-3 model at least seems to do surprisingly well. So that's an interesting takeaway. And then finally, let's look at some examples of predictions of the models and some error analysis. So again, as we said before, since models can generate any word from their more than 10,000 K vocabularies, what we want to look at is how related what their predictions are to the actual concept category, as a lot of people mentioned before. So we score relatedness of model predictions based on whether or not the first word that is predicted is in the set of all possible answers. So for example, was it in the set of spatial directions like left or right, or was it in the set of 300 colors that exist in the data set? If it's not, if it exists outside of that set, the model gets a 0 accuracy. And if it does, then its relatedness score is perfect. We see that it's actually quite surprising that the GPT-3 model gets like a nearly perfect relatedness score. So that means it learns this few shot fine tuning so well that it always ever predicts related concepts to the concept, to that grounded set that we were testing it on. However, the smaller models get about like a 50% or lower relatedness score, which means half the time what they're predicting are things that are completely unrelated, which hints at the fact that they might not be learning this few shot task well enough, and we might need a different way of training them to do better. So if you look at the smallest model for the color task, which is the 124 million parameter GPT-2 model, example related generations that it gives are just like standard color terms that were magenta or green or aqua or red. These may or may not be correct terms. Some of them were correct, as we saw with the accuracies, but these are related generations for the task. If you look at the full sentences that they sometimes generate, where they sometimes stop at one word, for example, just zeros or just magenta, but they sometimes generate full sentence lengths. These are just random generations that might be related to colors, but aren't the answer that we were trying to train them for in the task. However, when you look at the GPT-3 model and you look at the related generations, they're far more varied and far more diverse. Firstly, like light purple or light Bordeaux, or deep indigo or peach. And the unrelated generations are things like liver or sherbet or rhodolite that are not exactly colors, but are actually far more intuitive than things like these that you see from the 124M model, because they could actually be interpreted as colors in some way. It's also worth noting that there are almost no unrelated generations for the GPT-3 model, which is actually quite surprising, given that we only give them a small number of samples in few shot training. And that explains the performance, at least the vast difference in performance of this model versus the other models, which is quite interesting to see. What we also want to look at is when model predictions are related. So for example, when it says deep magenta or mint, but it's the case that deep magenta was not the correct answer, how far in the world are model predicted groundings from the true grounded answer in the world? So for example, if you look at all points within, for example, a Euclidean distance of 180 from the colors yellow in the first plot and then blue and then red, these are all points that are close enough in space to each of these concepts. As you can see, they're all colors that are like vaguely similar to that color. in this color space. So what we do is try to score model accuracies based on whether or not they're within some threshold, which is some Euclidean distance from the true color. And if they are, we give the model a perfect accuracy to see how well they're actually just grounding things in the space, even if it's not the perfect answer. We actually see that over here, if you look at the top one accuracy also, which is the very first prediction that the model gave, the GPT-3 model actually gets the 71% accuracy for the color task, which means it does predict things that are close enough in space, but with still technically incorrect answers. For example, it says wine instead of dark red, which is incorrect, but is close enough, which is quite promising. The other models still do a lot worse in general and have lower results. And if you look at some examples of things that the GPT-3 model predicted that were incorrect from the true grounding, but were close enough in space, that were all less than a 180 Euclidean distance in space, we see that they're actually quite intuitive. So it says dark red instead of wine, or it'll say medium apricot instead of apricot, or aquamarine instead of sea green, which again are technically incorrect terms, but are close enough in space. So this again seems to hint at the fact that it might be learning something about the space that we're grounding it in, but we do need to investigate this more. So in conclusion, we evaluated models on few-shot generalization, zero-shot generalization, and a bunch of other deeper analyses of what models are doing when we try to teach them these grounded concepts that they've never seen before. And we see that although these models have been trained only on text, it does seem to be the case that the structural relations between words that they have learned might have given them some amount of information about groundings. This is not perfect, even for the GPT-3 model. As we saw with the top one accuracies, the results are still pretty low. But it does seem to be the case that larger language models adapt far more quickly than the smaller ones. And it's kind of promising that they can actually learn some grounded concepts if only we can find the right way of prompting them correctly or teaching them concepts in a way that works best for each model. And again, it might differ for each of the models that we evaluate. It's worth noting that an obvious limitation, given that we're working with language models that have been trained only on text and can have only text inputs, is that our work is limited to grounded concepts that have to be represented in text. So for example, the worlds that we saw with the spatial directions or RGB codes of colors. This means that we could never do anything with images or 3D worlds or other dense representations that we wanted to give in if we wanted to give in as input to the model text. However, it's still kind of promising that you might be able to teach language models some elements of the world, which has lots of implications for other use cases of grounded models. For example, if it knows what things like left and right are, maybe this can be used for like reinforcement learning tasks. And if it knows things about colors, this has impacts for like cognitive science work. So that might be helpful if we could properly teach models how to ground different types of concepts. And that's mostly it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome, thanks.
We have our silent applause emojis.